halls of Oakwood Academy were quiet, but beneath the surface, tensions ran high. Mrs. Carter, a longtime teacher, had always been known for her strict ways, but there was something darker lurking in her heart. She had a reputation for making students feel small, especially the ones who didn't quite fit into her perfect world. When a new student, Jaden, arrived, eager and full of life, he unknowingly walked into a battle that would shake everything at Oakwood. A storm was brewing, but no one could predict the fallout. What happens when a teacher's hidden hatred meets a student's unshakable resolve? Who will break first, and who will find the strength to change? You won't want to miss this journey of tension, unexpected twists, and heart-stopping moments. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that leave you thinking, and don't forget to comment and share with others who love a tale of transformation and redemption. Stay tuned to find out what happens when lives collide in the most unexpected way. Oakwood Academy was the pride of Willow Creek, a town where traditions ran deep and change came slowly. For decades, the school had built a reputation for academic excellence, boasting a faculty of experienced teachers and generations of successful graduates. Its grand red brick building stood as a symbol of prestige, with neatly trimmed hedges and a towering oak tree at its entrance, a silent witness to the countless students who had walked through its doors. Among the staff was Mrs. Evelyn Carter, one of the longest-serving teachers at Oakwood Academy. With her stern expression, neatly pressed blouses, and air of authority, she commanded the classroom with strict discipline. To the school administration, she was a dedicated educator. To many parents, she was a respected teacher. But to the Black students who passed through her class, she was something else entirely. Mrs. Carter harbored a deep-seated hatred, one she never spoke aloud but demonstrated in every interaction. She believed Black students did not belong in her classroom, let alone in a school as distinguished as Oakwood Academy. Over the years, she had mastered the art of subtle cruelty. She would call on Black students only to embarrass them, dismiss their ideas as unimportant, and hold them to unfair standards. Their grades always seemed to be lower, their efforts never quite good enough. If a Black student struggled, she offered no help. If they excelled, she found a way to diminish their success. The other teachers either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. The students whispered about it but never spoke up. And the Black students who suffered under Mrs. Carter's quiet oppression learned one painful lesson early on. Arguing would only make things worse. For years, she went unchallenged, her prejudice hidden behind the mask of a respected teacher. Then one autumn morning, a new student walked into her classroom, Jaden Williams, bright-eyed, full of curiosity, and unaware of the storm awaiting him. Mrs. Carter took one look at him and felt the familiar resentment rise in her chest. Another one. She had made Black students feel small before, and she was certain Jaden Williams would be no different. But what she didn't know was that this time, everything was about to change. Jaden Williams had always been a hopeful child. At just 12 years old, he carried a heart full of kindness and a mind eager to learn. When his mother told him they were moving to Willow Creek and that he'd be attending Oakwood Academy, he saw it as a fresh start. He imagined making new friends, impressing his teachers, and showing everyone just how bright he was. On his first day, he dressed in his neatly ironed uniform, his backpack strapped tightly over his shoulders. As he stepped through the tall oak doors of the school, he took a deep breath, letting the excitement of new beginnings settle inside him. But the moment he entered Mrs. Carter's classroom, the warmth he felt disappeared. Mrs. Carter's sharp blue eyes landed on him, her expression tightening ever so slightly. To most, it was an ordinary glance, a simple acknowledgement of a new student. But to Jaden, it felt different, colder, unwelcoming. He felt something shift in the air, something he couldn't quite place. She forced a tight-lipped smile and read his name from the class roster. Jaden Williams, she said, as if the name itself left a bad taste in her mouth. Yes, ma'am, Jaden responded politely, offering a smile. She said nothing more. Instead of welcoming him like she did with other new students, she merely gestured toward an empty desk at the back of the classroom. No introduction, no effort to make him feel included. Jaden hesitated, but quickly took his seat, ignoring the sinking feeling in his chest. The first lesson began, and Jaden listened intently, eager to participate. He had always loved school, especially math. When Mrs. Carter posed a question to the class, Jaden's hand shot up, excitement bubbling inside him. But she didn't call on him. Instead, she scanned the room and picked another student, even though Jaden's hand had been the first to go up. At first, he thought it was just coincidence. Then it happened again and again. Throughout the week, Jaden noticed the small things, the way she called on other students, even if they didn't know the answer, while completely ignoring him, the way she scrutinized his work more harshly than others, the way her voice held a slight but unmistakable edge when speaking to him. He wasn't sure why she disliked him so much, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just strict teaching. It was something deeper. And as the days passed, it became painfully clear. Mrs. Carter didn't just dislike him. She hated him. Jaden had always been a strong student. Back at his old school, teachers praised his hard work, and he took pride in his achievements. But at Oakwood Academy, under Mrs. Carter's watch, nothing he did seemed to be good enough. No matter how well he answered questions on his assignments, his grades were always lower than he expected. A perfect essay came back with a C. A math test he had triple-checked was marked with unnecessary red ink, reducing his score unfairly. When he politely asked Mrs. Carter why, she gave him a cold stare. "You must have made mistakes somewhere," she said dismissively, before moving on. When Jaden raised his hand in class, she acted as though he were invisible. Even when he knew the answer and waved his hand eagerly, she would look right through him, calling on another student, any student, just to avoid acknowledging him. At first, Jaden tried to tell himself he was imagining things. Maybe he just wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe he needed to prove himself more. But then came the public humiliations. One afternoon, Mrs. Carter was handing back graded assignments. Jaden sat up straighter, hoping this time she would be fair. But when she reached his desk, she paused just long enough to let her disapproval settle in the air before slapping the paper down in front of him. "Messy work," she said loudly. "Sloppy handwriting. You need to do better." Jaden looked at his paper, an essay he had worked on for hours, carefully written in neat, legible print. His throat tightened, but he said nothing. The students around him shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, as if silently agreeing that Mrs. Carter was being unfair. But no one spoke up. No one ever did. They had seen it before, the way she treated black students. It was an unspoken rule. Stay quiet, or you'll be next. As the days turned into weeks, Jaden found himself dreading school. Not because of the subjects. He loved learning, but because of the constant, silent battle in Mrs. Carter's classroom. He worked twice as hard, only to be cut down every time. He kept his head high, only to be ignored and humiliated again and again. Still, he never spoke back. But deep inside, something was building, something waiting to break. The sky outside was dark with heavy clouds, thunder rumbling in the distance. The air in the classroom felt thick, tense, as if something unseen was pressing down on everyone. Mrs. Carter stood at the front of the room, her sharp eyes scanning the students as they worked on their assignments. Jaden sat at his desk, his pencil moving steadily across the paper. He had spent weeks enduring Mrs. Carter's unfair treatment, swallowing every insult, every humiliation. Today was no different. He had already been ignored twice when he raised his hand, and his last quiz had been returned with a grade lower than he deserved. Still, he kept his head down and focused. Then, Mrs. Carter walked past his desk. She stopped. She looked down at Jaden's hands, dark against the white sheet of paper. Her lips curled in distaste. "You should use a lighter pencil," she said suddenly, her voice laced with contempt. "It's hard to read your writing against all that darkness." The words hung in the air like a slap. The classroom fell completely silent. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest. His fingers clenched around his pencil, his knuckles turning white. He had tolerated so much, her dismissiveness, her unfair grading, her constant belittling. But this was different. For the first time, he looked up and met her eyes, his voice steady and clear. "I'm going to tell my mother." Mrs. Carter's smirk faltered. A few students gasped. Others glanced at each other, wide-eyed. Jaden pushed back his chair and stood up. His hands trembled, but his voice did not. "I'm telling my mother," he repeated, "and we'll see what she has to say about it." Without another word, he turned and walked straight toward the door. Mrs. Carter let out a small, mocking laugh. "Oh." And what exactly is she going to do? Jaden paused at the doorway. Then, with a knowing look, he said the words that made Mrs. Carter's face drain of color. "You'll see." And with that, he walked out. Jaden marched down the hallway, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and determination. For weeks, he had endured Mrs. Carter's cruelty in silence. But today she had crossed a line, and now she was about to face the consequences. He reached the principal's office and knocked firmly. "Come in," a strong yet calm voice called. Jaden pushed open the door, and there, sitting behind the grand wooden desk, was Principal Williams, his mother. She was a woman of quiet strength, her presence commanding respect without ever needing to raise her voice. She had worked tirelessly to become the first Black principal of Oakwood Academy, and she carried that honor with grace. When she saw her son standing in the doorway, she immediately noticed the storm in his eyes. "What's wrong, Jaden?" she asked, her voice steady but concerned. Jaden took a deep breath. "It's Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice firm. She insulted me. Not just today, but since the day I got here. She treats me unfairly, gives me lower grades, ignores me in class. And today she made fun of my skin." Principal Williams's eyes darkened, but she remained composed. She had heard murmurs about Mrs. Carter's behavior before, but no one had ever come forward with proof. Now, standing before her, was not just a student but her own son, finally exposing the truth. She stood up. "Go back to class, Jaden," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'll handle this." Jaden nodded, trusting her completely, and left the office. Within minutes, an announcement echoed through the school. "Mrs. Carter, please report to the principal's office immediately." Mrs. Carter walked into the office with her usual air of superiority, but the moment she saw Principal Williams sitting behind the desk, something in her shifted. She knew that Jaden was a student here, but she had never connected the dots. And now, standing before her, was the woman who had the power to change everything. Principal Williams folded her hands on her desk, her eyes steady. "Mrs. Carter, do you know why you're here?" Mrs. Carter forced a thin smile. "I assume this is about Jaden." "Yes," Principal Williams said. "He's my son." The color drained from Mrs. Carter's face. Principal Williams didn't raise her voice, didn't shout, but the authority in her tone was undeniable. "Jaden has told me everything, the unfair grading, the humiliation, and today, the racist comment." Mrs. Carter shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean it like that," she stammered. Principal Williams leaned forward. "Then tell me, Mrs. Carter, how did you mean it?" Silence. The weight of her own actions pressed down on her. For years, she had mistreated Black students without consequence. But now, she was facing a woman who wouldn't turn a blind eye. "I have two choices for you," Principal Williams continued. "You can resign today, quietly, or you can stay, but under one condition." Mrs. Carter swallowed hard. "And what would that be?" "You will attend mandatory anti-racism training led by educators and students you have mistreated," Principal Williams said firmly. "You will listen to their experiences, acknowledge your wrongdoings, and work to change. And if I hear even one more complaint, I will not hesitate to fire you." Mrs. Carter's hands trembled. She had spent years thinking she was untouchable, that no one would ever call her out. But now she had no choice but to face the truth. For the first time in her life, Mrs. Carter realized she had something to learn. After Principal Williams' ultimatum, Mrs. Carter reluctantly began her month at the Willow Creek Community Center. Initially, she saw it as nothing more than a punishment. She expected hostility and resistance, but what she found was a community filled with kindness, resilience, and strength. The center, a hub for Black families, was alive with laughter, learning, and support. Children eagerly worked on projects, while parents, like Rosa, who worked 2 jobs, sacrificed for their children's futures. Mrs. Carter, at first cold and distant, couldn't help but notice the determination and love surrounding her. One day, a boy named Jamal asked for help with a math problem. For the first time, Mrs. Carter saw him, not just as a student, but as a person eager to succeed. She sat with him, and in helping him, began to see something she'd never considered before: the strength and hope that Black children, families, and elders carried with them every day. She heard stories from Mr. Walker, an elderly man who had lived through the civil rights movement, and realized that the struggles of these families weren't just about survival. They were about thriving despite adversity. His words, "Our strength comes from community. Our strength comes from love, struck her deeply. By the end of the month, Mrs. Carter felt a shift within herself. She saw the Black community not as she had once believed, but as a vibrant, powerful force full of resilience and hope. The weight of her hatred had lifted, replaced by understanding and humility. As she walked back to Oakwood Academy, she knew her transformation was just beginning. The journey ahead would be long, but she was finally ready to walk it, one step at a time, with a heart open to learning and change. The day Mrs. Carter walked back into Oakwood Academy, she was a different person. The walls she had built around her heart were gone, replaced by a quiet humility. The woman who once carried hatred now understood the weight of her actions, and she was determined to make things right. As she entered her classroom, she saw Jaden sitting at his desk, his expression calm but watchful. The other students sensed the change in her too, but none spoke as she approached Jaden's desk. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Mrs. Carter took a deep breath and spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Jaden," she began, "I owe you an apology. For the way I treated you, for the hurt I caused, you didn't deserve it." Jaden looked up at her, his eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond his years. He had seen the change in her. He had felt it in the way she had carried herself that morning. There was no bitterness in his heart, just a quiet understanding. "You don't have to apologize," he said softly, "but I believe people can change. I think you can too." Mrs. Carter's heart swelled with both gratitude and regret. She had wronged him, but in his eyes she saw the grace she didn't deserve. He was giving her a chance to prove herself, not just to him, but to all of them. The rest of the class watched, a silent witness to the moment that marked a turning point not just for Mrs. Carter, but for Oakwood Academy. She had changed, but so had they. They had all learned a lesson in forgiveness, in redemption, and in the power of second chances. From that day on, Mrs. Carter was a different teacher. She no longer held the cruel biases that had once defined her. She listened more, cared more, and believed in every student's potential, especially Jaden's. The school would never be the same again, nor would she. Because in the end, it wasn't just Jaden who had learned the most valuable lesson. It was Mrs. Carter, and that lesson would stay with her always. And that, my friends, is the power of change. What began as a story of prejudice and pain ended with a lesson in redemption, forgiveness, and growth. Mrs. Carter's journey wasn't easy, but it's one that reminds us all that it's never too late to change for the better. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share with those who could use a little inspiration today. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what you think about Mrs. Carter's transformation. Thank you for joining us, and remember, every story has the potential to change a life. Stay tuned for more powerful journeys right here on Storytime with Rose.